We're so happy to have Carin Bloom with us. Carin is the manager of education and programming for the Historic Charleston Foundation, where she plans programming and digital history for learners of all ages. Carin came to South Carolina from the Philadelphia area, where she went to school for historical archaeology, excavating at Valley Forge National Historical Park. She has an honors BA from the University of Delaware and MAs from both the University of Pennsylvania and Temple University. I'm impressed, Carin, by that. She's been doing public history for over 20 years at various sites in the Mid-Atlantic and in the Charleston area. Carin's dedicated to bringing underrepresented narratives to light, as are we, and moving the field of history forward as an inclusive discipline that shares diverse and necessary perspectives. With a decade of experience interpreting colonial and antebellum plantation life in the Charleston area under her belt, Carin now has the opportunity through Historic Charleston Foundation to focus on urban narratives of an early American city and all of its complexities. And we are particularly interested in what Carin has to say because as we learn more about the people who were enslaved at Locust Grove, we realize that the urban story is part of their story too. So Carin's excited to share her observations today, and I will stop talking and let her do just that. Thank you, Carin.
Thank you all so much for having me. I just really appreciate it. I love everything that y'all are doing out there at Locust Grove, and I cannot wait to come and visit in person. I really want to come and visit your site and see all the amazing things that y'all are doing. Thank you so much for this invitation and for this opportunity. The subject of urban enslavement is really big. I was telling Caitlin as we were practicing the screen sharing earlier that this presentation really took a lot because I had to edit a lot. So we are only going to scratch the surface here today. There is a lot more to do and to understand and to read about. And we're going to focus mostly on the city of Charleston, South Carolina, because that's where I am. Every now and again, I'll be able to bring in some comparisons with some other cities, but yeah, I'm just thrilled to be here and thank you all so much. And I see so many names that I recognize personally in the Zoom window. Thank you all so much for being here. It just means so much to me that all of you are interested in this subject. This is how we share really underrepresented narratives that need to be shared. So thank you so much for being here. I'm going to move my little chat window out of my way and share screen. Let's pick a screen. How about this one? It feels a little bit like roulette. Okay. Hopefully everybody can see my screen now. Are we good, Caitlin?
Looks great.
Great. All right. So thank you again, Carol and Caitlin and Jeffrey for inviting me. I really appreciate the opportunity to sort of talk about one of the big things that the museums department at Historic Charleston Foundation does. And just in case, I think we need to start before we talk about urban enslavement with talking about the institution of slavery in general. So, what is American slavery as we understand it in the historical context? First of all, it was an incredibly dynamic institution. It wasn't static. It was different from household to household, from city to country, from region to region, and from time period to time period. So enslavement in Charleston in 1690 is very different from enslavement in Charleston in 1790 or in the 1850s. And none of those is the same as enslavement in those same time periods in the northern colonies and states, nor in the Chesapeake, in the Maryland and Virginia area, nor in Georgia or Alabama or Louisiana or Texas or Kentucky. So there are so many stories and nuances to still dig out and understand. When we speak in generalities like I'm going to today, it is really because the subject is so large and so dynamic. It's really not coverable in an hour. So we'll do our best. Overall, it was about gaining labor from people without fairly compensating them. It was about treating humans as something less than human, as treating people as chattel. And the methodologies for doing so were essentially a free-for-all. When humans are treated like chattel, all manner of treatment suddenly becomes justifiable in the minds of the enslavers. So I'm sure that Caitlin and Carol can attest, one of the questions that we get most at any of the historic sites that I've ever worked at that dealt with the enslavement of humans was, were they good masters? And the answer is there really is no such thing. There are variations of circumstances, but in the end, enslavement is a condition under which people did not have freedom. And so it doesn't matter how good the circumstance was that those individuals found themselves in. The other thing that you should remember is that since the institution was ever changing, the laws that governed it were eternally trying to catch up with and regulate it. But one thing is certain, until the conclusion of the Civil War, the laws of the land all sanctioned and protected the institution of enslavement. They did not do anything to eradicate it. That's really important to note. So, all right. So that said, there are a few things that were pretty unchanging through time, and they were perhaps expressed by a quote from a freed man named Garrison Frazer. The Reverend Garrison Frazer actually purchased his own freedom and that of his wife for the sum of $1,000 in gold and silver in 1857. So he purchased his own freedom prior to emancipation. And in January of 1865, William Tecumseh Sherman and his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, gathered a group of Black ministers in Savannah, Georgia, and they interviewed them. And there's a link on this slide for the complete interview. Maybe we can drop that in the chat or something, Caitlin, so that people can check it out. It's a fascinating interview. It's really telling, and it's brilliant because it quotes Reverend Frazer and his answer as the representative of this group of free Black ministers. He was elected to speak for the group, and when he was asked to state his understanding of slavery, he replied that slavery is the receiving by irresistible power the work of another man, and not by his consent. It's one sentence. He actually goes on to talk more about his understanding of freedom. It was gatherings like this one and other interviews that were done at the end of the Civil War that came up with the idea of how can newly emancipated people succeed as American citizens, and the idea of 40 acres and a mule. That came out of interviews like this one with Reverend Frazer. So I definitely recommend that you check out this link and read the entire interview. But that one sentence right there is the crux of it. Of course, people who were enslaved understood the condition under which they lived, and they understood that the reason that the work was received was because of the power exerted over them, not because they were giving their consent to the work. So as I mentioned, for our purposes, we're going to look mainly at the city of Charleston. I will occasionally do my best to give some comparisons from other cities, known experiences, but I'll also give you some book recommendations at the end that you can check out yourself. One in particular that has case studies from different cities. Okay, the other thing you should know is that I am not a statistician, so this is the only slide where you will see numbers and figures. That's just who I am. If you process information this way, that's excellent, and hopefully this is helpful for you. I'm not one of those, so here is what I have compiled for you. By 1708, very early after the settlement and colonization of the area that we now call South Carolina, there was a Black majority here, and that's because it was made up of enslaved people. By the 1740s, just a few short decades later, in Philadelphia, 15% of the entire workforce of that city was enslaved. By 1750, the enslaved population of Rhode Island as an entire state was over 3,000 people. During the American Revolution, the working population of New York City, the Black population, was somewhere between 12 and 14%. These are not small numbers. This is a fair number of people in cities that are just starting to grow. Georgia had a population of 16,000 enslaved people in the entire state by the end of the Revolution, and most of those came through the port at Savannah, and many of them stayed in the city. And the census of 1860 shows that the population of Charleston County was 61.5% enslaved. So there were very few decades between 1700 and 1860 when the population of enslaved Blacks did not outnumber free whites. So what does that work look like? It's a very simple list of work that should look familiar to you. This is a comparison, of course, of urban enslavement and rural enslavement. We get a lot of information about enslavement on plantations. And by the way, for as much as we get, even that is incomplete. But a lot of the job descriptions here should look familiar, because when you learn about enslavement on a plantation, these are the kinds of jobs that are being done. The same is true in the cities. And as the years progress and as life moves into the 19th century, the variety only grows. But if you consider an urban plantation, a great big mansion house that somebody who probably also owns plantations has built for them, there's a workyard, there are separate quarters, there is a main house structure, there is a garden, there is a poultry yard, there is a carriage house, there's a stable. So it's really a smaller microcosm of what's going on out in the rural sections of the country. So it's just on a smaller scale. I'm not going to read all of those to you. I trust that you can check them all out. So another thing that I should mention is that Bernie Powers, Dr. Bernard Powers, in his book Black Charlestonians, he actually expresses that there's a great variety of jobs held by the enslaved of Charleston in the 19th century, and the list only grows. He identifies something like 38 different skilled labor jobs that are held by enslaved people in just 19th century Charleston. Another similarity that we will see, of course, is freedom seeking. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. So what are common conditions that we see between the enslaved circumstance in urban settings and in rural settings? The common conditions we see are that the individuals who are enslaved in urban settings have a very similar experience to those who are enslaved on plantations, but whose jobs are in the house. They're considered domestics or artisan work or something that makes them particular. And that means that they are likely known to their enslavers by name and by face. That's not a good thing. Usually that means that if the enslaver is having a bad day, or if somebody is angry, or there's no reason and an upset person wants to take out their anger on someone, they're likely going to go for a form of domestic abuse in terms of abusing somebody that is known to them. That also means that folks are being observed more frequently and more directly. You're kind of always under the eye of the one who is enslaving. And so there's very little chance for agency. There's less chance for agency. Individuals who are enslaved in urban settings are subject to any number, therefore, of psychological and physical abuses. And much like their counterparts on the plantation, everybody no matter how close they are to an enslaving family, is subject to the potential of sale of themselves or their family members and the breaking up of family units. So that's something to remember as a commonality across the institution of enslavement and across time. There are always negative repercussions for freedom seeking, including corporal punishment, time at the workhouse. There were lots of workhouses downtown and people were sent there as a form of correction. Incarceration was another potential negative repercussion of seeking freedom. So, and there are others, I'm just giving a small sample. And of course, no matter what, under the condition of enslavement in America, and European Americans who created this system really created a global commodity, and they created an economic system that relied on the work of enslaved people. The society as they knew it would not have functioned without the institution of enslavement. And that's what makes it different from any other form of enslavement that the world has seen before or since. This society relied on that institution. And along with that comes that an enslaved individual's life is forfeit at the whim of their enslaver. Somebody could be having a bad day. It's not against the law. It was not against the law to punish or even to kill one's own enslaved person. It was against the law to murder someone else's property. And that is, again, how enslaved people were considered, as property, not humans. There was a condition that we can find that is different from city to country. The urban enslaved actually occasionally had the potential to live apart from their enslavers. Those who claimed ownership over the enslaved did not necessarily require those enslaved individuals to live on the property with the enslaver. For example, in Charleston by the 1850s, 15% of the enslaved population lived separately from their enslavers, but they were still enslaved. They were not free. They had not self-emancipated. There was an opportunity or more opportunity for hiring out. This was sometimes done by enslavers, and that was sometimes done by the enslaved themselves. That means oftentimes that a portion of the wages earned by an artisan enslaved person who hires out comes back to that individual. There is an opportunity for artisan enslaved workers then to start to save up some money. It almost never was enough to purchase freedom, almost never. This is part of what I consider the psychological warfare of the institution of slavery. The idea that if people who are forced to live in the condition in which you put them are given small glimpses of agency, independence, care, then the idea of the enslaver is to keep individuals happy so that they do not rebel, run away, etc. And of course, we know better. We know that people in general were not content in the institution of enslavement. But that was the thinking. If enslavers keep the enslaved content, then nothing will go wrong. So the idea of having this open-handed relationship of hiring out and then giving some of that wage back to the enslaved worker would be a way to keep people content. Another thing that happened is as artisan work grew and the variety grew for enslaved people in the city, that actually ended up bringing out complaints to city governments in the form of working class free whites who were complaining that enslaved workers were taking all their jobs. There were no jobs for them. They couldn't get work, and that it was essentially ruining the economy. There were several attempts by the city government here in Charleston to make laws restricting what enslaved people could do, how much, how often they could be hired out. And none of those laws managed to stay on the books, because who are the people making the laws? The people who are in power in the government are the same people who are enslaving people in the city and in the country. So those laws never held, and that complaint, as far as I know, persisted. In particular, I thought this was strange, but in particular, Bernie Powers notes that coopers were a particular target of these complaints. And if you don't know, coopers are barrel makers, and barrels were in high demand here in Charleston because that's how rice was shipped. Butchers, bakers, tailors, shoemakers, all of these jobs are in high demand, and there were many, many enslaved people to fulfill them. Urban centers offered a much more diverse population. The city of Charleston was very diverse. It had several different ethnic and religious groups from very early in the 18th century living side by side, cheek by jowl with one another. And that meant that this environment was a ripe one for urban enslaved to learn. That meant that perhaps enslavers were apprenticing enslaved people to artisan masters to learn a trade. Perhaps these enslaved who are in fact able to live apart from their masters have the opportunity to learn to read and to write. Sometimes that was even encouraged by the enslavers. So there was a lot of differing opportunity that perhaps those enslaved in the country may not have had access to. The urban enslaved also had more choices in their clothing and personal adornment, being able to personalize that. And it does seem, in the small bit of research that has been done so far, it does seem that there was an opportunity for better quality of clothing amongst the urban enslaved versus those who worked out in the country. I think more research needs to be done on this topic. That's certainly how Hollywood portrays it, but I think that we need to do a little bit more. I think it's a more nuanced situation than that, because of course, those who are interacting with business partners and visitors out on the plantations in the rural settings, those who are seen in the house and in and around the enslaving family probably would have been very well dressed. In fact, we know they would have been. We have record of livery and particular buttons and shoe buckles and particular fabrics that are used in their clothing. So though it seems true that the enslaved in an urban setting had more and better access to clothing and personal adornment in particular, I think that that's an incomplete topic. And of course, urban life out from under the eyes of an enslaver means that there's an opportunity to build community. They were able to exert some autonomy, celebrate marriages and funerals, which are noted in historical record as often happening at night. Church services, creating faith communities around their own communities, which again is in direct contrast to enslavers taking their enslaved to church with them, which was also highly encouraged. So we see a lot of variety occurring within enslaved communities depending on their urban circumstances. And of course, we see a little bit more of exercising of individual agency when enslaved people are able to remove themselves and separate themselves from the enslaved space. And that means opportunities like going to church at night. It also means opportunities like going to the grog shop at night. There are plenty of free whites in the city of Charleston who are doing exactly the same thing. It's considered morally improper, no matter who is doing it. Technically, there's a law against selling alcohol to enslaved people in the city of Charleston, but business and the fledglings of capitalism started early, so it happened even if it wasn't supposed to in these after dark establishments. So from Bernie Powers' book, Black Charlestonians, he writes that slave housing sometimes formed enclaves where the residents lived or visited safely beyond the master's constant scrutiny. One such place was Cliffords Alley, and I believe that this has been renamed Jacob's Alley. You can see it here in the screen. It was listed as running west from King Street between Queen and Clifford, which is up here. So this is Queen, this is Clifford, and this is west of King Street. The church that's right here has been there since the 18th century. This one has been there since the 19th century. And the only other alley that exists on this map is an access to the church, the churchyard back here, and it runs right through here. So I think that Clifford's Alley in 1861 has been renamed as Jacob's Alley. And thanks to my wonderful partner, we were able to get a look at the street view of that. Great. Bernie Powers, of course, says that here in 1861, 76 slaves and 1 white lived in wooden houses on both sides of the street. So it's not surprising to me that these wooden houses no longer exist. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Charleston's history, there have been floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, fires, and of course the great earthquake of 1886. So it does not surprise me, in fact, that the wooden houses that may have stood along Clifford's Alley have made way for a modern shoe store and interior design center. But in theory, if we were to walk down this way, that would be Jacob's Alley or Clifford's Alley. So this is still extant on the landscape today. You can still at least walk in the spaces where enclaves of enslaved community found some relief from their condition of enslavement. Which often leads to a question. Was it better? Was it better to be enslaved in the city than to be enslaved in the country? No. By 1861, only 15% of Charleston's enslaved lived apart from their enslavers. People still resisted in droves. There was work slowdown. There were, of course, freedom-seeking attempts. There were well-documented rebellions. Just because some circumstances may have appeared to offer more opportunity than others, that still doesn't negate the circumstance of being enslaved. And we have to remember that ultimately that is the experience of those who had been taken from Africa and later born in this country in enslavement. Those who resisted, those who self-emancipated did in fact find it easier to hide in cities. The self-emancipated had been doing so very well since prior to the American Revolution. In fact, there are eyewitness accounts of enslaved, or rather formerly enslaved, self-emancipated individuals who had been sighted in the city of Charleston, but never captured. It's easier to blend in an urban, busy, diverse place. And then, of course, there are the slave patrols, which are prominent in cities starting even in the 18th century, but they're really revving up by the 19th century. By the mid-1850s, the Charleston's police force was 250 strong, and it was set up to provide supervision and precautions. Something that we should think about is that these slave patrols were the precursor to law enforcement. And all across this fledgling country, there were guard posts being set up. Here in Charleston, it was called the City Guard. And it was established in order to enforce local laws. In the beginning, especially in southern cities, those laws were largely referring to the control of enslaved and free Black populations. They controlled dress, movement, choices, activities, agency that Black people could exercise. And there was a law passed here in 1823. And this is a content warning in terms of quoting historical sources. It was called the Negro Seamen's Act of 1823. It restricted the movements of free Black sailors coming to Charleston. any Black mariner who sailed into the port of Charleston because that's where their boat was coming to onload or offload cargo was required to be confined either to their vessel or to a lodging house ashore under lock and key. And if a captain or a ship owner could not pay for food and lodging under lock and key, those free Black mariners could be seized and sold into enslavement here in this city. So there were laws that were passed and law enforcement agencies that were created to protect those laws, and they affected both enslaved and free Blacks in this city, starting in the 19th century. But it's not just laws. People manage to flout laws all the time. And by that, I mean usually enslavers. There was a law against allowing enslaved people or teaching enslaved people to read and write. And we know that enslavers did that actually rather frequently anyway. They wanted enslaved people to read the Bible or help with their account books or any number of things. So we know that laws were quite frequently flouted. One thing that is easy to see a measure of control in urban environments is the built environment, the architecture of enslavement. And frankly, it's an architecture of fear. Because the city of Charleston was majority Black from early days, there seems to be a consensus among researchers that there was a constant anxiety, a constant sense of fear of a group of people who were kidnapped and brought here and constantly othered and demeaned as inhuman, and then looked at with fear of uprising, of violence. So the architecture reflects that. Gina Haney, in her essay, it calls it landscapes of senses, because it's not just the buildings that we need to talk about in terms of control and architecture. So we'll get into that. These images here that you're looking at are from the Aiken Rhett House. This is a Historic Charleston Foundation House Museum property, and they really express the architecture of what I would call fear in the urban context. So let's get a little context. Here in Charleston, just down the river in 1739, the Stono Rebellion, it was on a plantation outside of the city of Charleston, and it resulted in the deaths of over 24 white people. That set off a whole set of laws, some of the most draconian slave laws that the country has ever seen. They were, of course, revised over the decades and over the centuries. In 1822, very famous Denmark Vesey, some people pronounce it Vesey, created a conspiracy, a plot for uprising of the urban enslaved. He himself was free at the time that he was trying to incite enslaved workers to rise up. Unfortunately, his plot was informed upon, and the plot failed, and Denmark Vesey was executed. But before, between, and after these two events, other freedom-seeking, other rebellion, other uprisings were attempted, and the architecture of Charleston really took shape that can reflect sort of a reaction to these kinds of rebellions. Here are some municipal buildings in Charleston. On the top left is the Powder Magazine, or I'm sorry, not the Powder Magazine, the old Provost Dungeon and Exchange. That was a huge building. That was a customs house. So this is one of the places where ship captains would have had to report on their custom, including human cargo. On the top right is what is known in Charleston as the Four Corners of Law. There's a church. There is today a federal post office. There is a state courthouse. And then, of course, there's the city council building, City Hall. So those are the four corners of law, all very imposing buildings built in varying decades before emancipation came. And on the bottom there, what is today on Marion Square, a Best Western hotel, was once the Citadel. And this is the original city guard post. And this is where, early law enforcement would have done their work from. Most of these buildings were not only built to control the enslaved population, they were built by the enslaved population. Residential, also warehouses. You can see on the wharves there were numerous wharves in the city of historic Charleston, and all of them would have been populated by enslaved workers as well as free Blacks, mariners. That's not Rainbow Row. It just happens to be a brightly colored residential block. And then, of course, there's some of the more sinister architecture. If you're walking around Charleston, you really can't miss it. Once you see it, you will never unsee it. And in particular, I'm talking about Chavo de Frise. There's a French anti-cavalry in its original form method of warfare. And originally, Chavo de Frise were not at the tops of walls, gates, and fences. They were freestanding objects that were placed in the way of a charging cavalry to deter horses and riders from attacking whatever army was defending itself with them. In 19th century Charleston, they became part of the urban landscape. This is the Miles Bruton House. It is a massive Georgian mansion right here in Charleston on King Street. And you can see the very sinister looking Chavo de Frise. This was meant to keep certain elements out, deterring violence upon the enslavers within. It was also designed to keep invested elements in. It's a deterrent from freedom seeking. So in this way, architecture is used to control movement. Similarly, architecture was used to control movement in cities like Annapolis, but that was more through city planning in Annapolis, Maryland. So there's a great comparison in a book that I'm going to recommend to you between the architecture and urban planning of the cities of Annapolis and Charleston. So it doesn't have to be a grand mansion like the Miles Bruton House to find Chavo de Frise. The two buildings on the left are the same building. That's the gate for that small residence there in the center. And then on the right is a fence line that actually surrounds the First Baptist Church downtown in Charleston. So you can also see small ridges of Chavo de Frise directly under windows and stuck in the bricks in the sides of buildings. So I encourage you, when you look around historic cities, see if there's this kind of architecture. It's not all earthquake bolts and decorative elements. There's really some important elements of control that are right in the naked eye that you may not consider as historic. Of course, people today still use fences that have spikes on the top, but this goes back much, much further than that and for a very direct purpose. So two of these houses are Historic Charleston Foundation properties, and one just happens to be on Meeting Street, or maybe it's on State Street. The Samuel Wainwright House is not an HCF property, but it is an 18th century dwelling. So I wanted to put it there to give you a little contrast. Samuel Wainwright actually was a loyalist, and so he left after the American Revolution. Nathaniel Russell House is a Historic Charleston Foundation property dating to 1808. And Nathaniel Russell was a wealthy merchant from Rhode Island who was able to have this great mansion constructed because not only was he a rich merchant, he was a merchant of people. Most of the money that he made was through trading enslaved Africans. And the Aiken-Rhett House, which you saw a little bit earlier, is also a Historic Charleston Foundation property dating to 1820 and enters the Aiken family in 1825. And it is probably the most stark example in the city of enslaved architecture still extant. Here's some of that architecture. When the enslaved did live on the same property as their enslavers, they were present in all of the spaces, inside the house, inside the quarters, in the workyard, but the activities that were done in those spaces varied. Spaces in the workyard here and the quarters, which are here and here. Can you all see my mouse? Are we good? These all are spaces that were pretty exclusively enslaved. They're owned by the enslaver, but they are mostly populated by enslaved persons and the work and community that they find there. This is the kitchen. So if we were to walk in this door right here, this is the view that we would see. Expanded and updated in 1830s to the height of technology, this stove right over here, where fires would be placed in these little alcoves, and then a cast iron cooktop on the top. So the height of sophistication. And somehow having better technology was supposed to, I don't know, make enslavement better. It didn't. This is the hallway in the quarters above the kitchen and laundry. So up here, if we were standing about here and looking down the hall that way, this is what we would see. So you can see the windows that look out into the yard don't even go directly into rooms. They go into a hallway. So these are robber windows, which means that the windows that are in the rooms that the enslaved occupied as their bed and sleeping quarters didn't even look out into the yard. They looked out into a hallway, and the light was coming from the robber windows in the hallway. All of it an architecture of control. High walls, the main house here. Can you see all of the windows that look down onto the yard? Constant observation, constant surveillance. These buildings that have windows looking down into the yard do not have windows looking outside the property, out into the free world. So this is meant to be this enslaved community's entire world. Here's another view of that hallway in the upstairs. Back beyond the workyard here would have been a formal garden. So that's very interesting because visitors to the Aiken family, if they were entering through the formal garden, they would have to walk through the workyard to get to the house, and vice versa. If they're visiting at the house and they wish to go take a walk in the garden, they have to go through the workyard and observe all of the work that's happening in the enslaved community. This is the carriages and stables here, and then more enslaved quarters up above. And these photos of the hallways here are taken on very bright sunny days. You need a bright sunny day, otherwise it's quite dark in there. At the Nathaniel Russell House, which is a restored space, there is a kitchen house behind. So the main house is here. It's connected by a hyphen, and then the kitchen house with enslaved quarters up above is this brick building here. And inside, it's been stripped back to the studs because there is an incredible restoration project going on here. Lots of archaeology has occurred. The kitchen house is a whole separate conversation, which if Locust Grove will have me back, I'd be happy to talk about. But the archaeology that's been done here has revealed rats' nests. And rats' nests are incredible time capsules. Rats were not found in the big house. It was only the kitchen house that was infested. This information is being analyzed by zooarchaeologists at my alma mater, the University of Pennsylvania. And the professor there said, I will never forget it. She said, I have no doubt that the people who worked in this space saw rats all day, every day, even while they were working, even in the daylight. And that at night when they slept, all of them, men, women, and children, had rats running over them in their sleep. Urban enslavement came with a whole other set of unconscionable circumstances. And when we go to static museums, when we go to austere restored spaces, we don't often think about the landscape of senses, the sights, the sounds, the smells, the tangible evidence of rats running across people in their sleep, or scurrying in the corners of the kitchen as one is trying to prepare a meal. We really can do more as an interpretive space to bring in the landscape of senses. the whole city would have been noisy. The whole city would have been noisy. So would this house. This is inside the main house of the Nathaniel Russell House, but this house would have been noisy, not with cooking or work noises. This would have been probably noisy with the sounds of visitors having a good time, children running around. Those who would not be making noise in this space would be the enslaved, who would be in every single room, attending to every single need, seen but probably not heard, and going about business to make sure that everything runs smoothly. But the city would have been noisy, and especially the workyards. This is a very nice aerial view of modern day Charleston, just to give you an idea of the scope of what it is now. But again, marketers would have been in the squares. There would have been the sounds of work being done. Some things don't change. Downtown, we still have construction noises all of the time, road and housework. Sailors calling out to load and unload ships, warehouse workers. We would have seen people moving goods, brick masons, carpenters, coopers, blacksmiths ringing out. We know that Nathaniel Russell had a brickyard in one of his earlier homes on East Bay Street, right next to the wharves, which would have been noisy. Inside shops, business would have been conducted between merchant and buyer. And because Charleston was so dependent on enslaved labor, it seemed to many white visitors and residents that the city just teemed with enslaved people. There was one Swedish traveler, and again, that same content warning for that same word. A Swedish traveler named Fredrika Bremer wrote in the 1850s, "Negroes swarm in the streets," end quote. She said, and I quote, "2/3 of the people whom one sees out in the town are Negroes or mulattoes." Again, let's remember these words are not appropriate for use in modern context. She wrote that in the 1850s. The actual number for the city of Charleston was more like 50% and rising. It was a majority, so 53% and rising. Later on in the decade, it was about 57% Black in the city, but it certainly wasn't 2 out of 3 people. But that's what it seemed to her. And I think that plays into that same emotional and psychological culture of fear that had been built up in the European and European American mind about cities like Charleston. Around the grog shops, one resident remarked that the enslaved were drunken and riotous and could be found, quote, lounging, pitching scents, playing marbles, cursing and blaspheming, end quote, in defiance of those laws prohibiting the sale of alcohol to enslaved persons. Well, certainly that's happening in grog shops that serve white Charlestonians as well, but visitors and residents chose in their historical writings to remark about the behavior of the enslaved in urban settings. As I had mentioned earlier, enslaved people were encouraged to go to church with their enslavers. And when they did, there was actually remark from visitors and residents of the city of Charleston about the appearance of the enslaved. It was commentary on actually how well-dressed people were. John Lambert said of enslaved women from Santo Domingo who now lived in the city of Charleston that they were distinguished from the rest by their colorful handkerchiefs tastily tied about their heads, the smartness of their dress, long flowing shawls or muslin handkerchiefs thrown carelessly over their shoulders a la Francoise. George Gordon remarked about the difference between enslaved men during the week in their sweat and slouch hats and shirt sleeves rolled up, and then on Sundays wearing their fine clothes, silk hats, and gloves. So the dynamics between groups of enslaved people aside, because that's a whole other presentation talking about the dynamics amongst the enslaved communities themselves. Different jobs carried different social weight within the enslaved communities of urban enslavement themselves. But despite that status symbol, the sight of enslaved people in cosmopolitan settings dressed very finely was still startling enough to visitors for them to comment on it in their travel journals and diaries. So it must have been frequent enough that people were seeing it and remarking upon it. So because Charleston was a slavery dependent city, as I mentioned earlier, laws, rules, curfews, this goes back to that landscape of senses. It wasn't just work that was making the city noisy. It was also things like a curfew imposition. So at 9 o'clock in the winter and at 10 o'clock in the summer, people were required to be at home. There was a curfew. And the way that the curfew was sounded was through the bells of St. Michael's Church there in the Four Corners of Law and the drum beats from the Citadel. And there are contemporary accounts of visitors in the city who heard the drums and said, man, it sounds like this city is on the verge of siege. It's as if there's about to be another revolution here every night. It is suggested that this raucous noise of announcing curfew really did strike fear into the hearts of the enslaved, that they had better get home before the city guard arrested them. And in fact, it was the job of the city guard to do that. But it seems that perhaps they didn't have so much of an appetite for curfew breakers in particular. In 1837, a total of 573 arrests were reported for breaking curfew, and that amounts to less than 0.5% of the entire enslaved population of this city in that year. So it was happening. It wasn't anything but this culture of control, but it certainly wasn't where the city guard was focusing its attention when enforcing laws regarding enslaved and Black agency and movement. Another set of noise that would be heard during the 18th and 19th centuries was this. That central image is in fact meant to be an auction of enslaved people on the streets of Charleston. You can see on the left-hand side an advertisement from Nathaniel Russell himself, a cargo to be sold for produce, the paper medium, or specie. And then another ad on the right-hand side there. These sounds would have permeated the city of Charleston. Interestingly enough, and this was likely a scenario that was seen in a lot of slaveholding cities. Savannah had auctions of enslaved people, Richmond, clear up to Philadelphia and Boston, but it tapered out in the north much sooner than it did in the south. Interestingly enough, in Charleston, by about 1859, this was a very unpopular practice out in the open. So if you remember the Exchange Customs House and Provost Dungeon, where the red circle is, this little woody area that's now a parking lot has this marker set up in it because it was right there on the north side of the exchange where enslaved people were bought and sold for the majority of the time that Charleston was a slave city. In 1856, the city banned auctions of enslaved and other goods from the exchange. By 1859, they banned outdoor auctions altogether. And that was a law that was frequently violated. Enslaved auctions out in the street could be heard right up until the eve of the Civil War. But the image in the center here is Ryan's Mart. This is now the old Slave Mart Museum. It's one of the few remaining sites, if not the only remaining site in the city of Charleston that was once an indoor market for the auctioning of enslaved people. And it's now a museum, which is great because you can go and look and learn about all of that. There was a work yard in the back and a jail, an incarceration point. But it's interesting, I think, that the noise that was distasteful to Charlestonians by 1859 was the sale of human cargo, something to really consider as we go about. And then you can see Broad Street, site of domestic slave trade. This is on a building at the foot of Broad Street, right across from that old exchange building. You can see these markers. There aren't enough of them around town, but really take a look at historic markers when you go around historic cities, because you might just see something that you didn't expect. And this one is placed by the College of Charleston to bring a broader context to the history of Charleston as people are walking around it. Sidebar, it was illegal to import Africans for enslavement by 1808 in this country, but the domestic purchase and sale of enslaved people persisted, of course, through the Civil War. However, as late as 1858, ships carrying kidnapped Africans are coming in at the port of Savannah. In New York City, the height of the illegal slave trade from Africa was happening in 1859 and 1860. Ships were leaving to go to the African coast on very flimsy pretenses, and there was a whole system of support set up, from shipwrights and fitters to crew recruiters to captains to ship owners to port agents and marshals who had been bribed to allow all of this, the comings and goings of these ships, under pretenses that really were nonsensical. And it allowed the illegal trade of African enslaved people to persist right up until the eve of the Civil War. Interestingly enough, there were at least a few people who were self-aware in the city of Charleston. Reverend Adger said, "They belong to us, we also belong to them. They are divided out among us and mingled up with us, and we with them in 1,000 ways." It was understood in the city of Charleston just how intimate this connection was, just how intertwined the lives were, and just how much the city itself depended on, relied upon the work of the enslaved. Without them, the city of Charleston would not have existed, and certainly would not have been as rich as it was. So it's interesting to see historical contemporary evidence of people that knew it and were willing to express it, but did not change it. Right, so I fear I'm running over time. Caitlin, you can just cut me off whenever, but I was asked about this specifically, so I wanted to really quickly address urban enslavement in Hollywood. Oh my, there isn't much. This is about it, what you're looking at here. 12 Years a Slave didn't even really, because Solomon Northup was a free man who was kidnapped in the city and then sent to a plantation to be enslaved. But there is some portrayal of urban enslavement in this film. It's pretty accurate, it's pretty realistic, it's overstated at times. There's little focus on the resiliency and perseverance of the enslaved populations that Northup interacts with and becomes a part of outside of himself. Now, I understand that this is a creative choice by the filmmakers because this is a story about Solomon Northup, so I get that. But I will never forget, after a screening, an audience member, a Black audience member, said, "I wish that there had been more emphasis on the persistence of culture, the perseverance of Black people through the institution of slavery." And I think we hear that a lot in terms of our interpretations on historic sites as well. So that's important that we take into consideration as well. That doesn't diminish in any way the horror that these sites perpetrated and the people perpetrated on those who were enslaved. That is not the end of the story. The end of the story is much more about resilience and persistence and contribution and cultural retention and agency retention, being able to decide for oneself. So 12 Years a Slave is good. It's really good. But there were some, requests from others. This one here, Mercy Street, was actually put on my radar by Caitlin. Thank you so much. I bought it, I watched it. It's fantastic. I wish it hadn't been canceled. This is from PBS, my friends. You can find it on Amazon Prime, and it is really excellent portrayal. So, okay, here's 12 Years a Slave, and you can actually see, I just put these screen captures up. These are both on the plantation, the cotton plantation, and you can see how people are portrayed, how people are dressed, how people are asked to hold themselves to portray a certain human element or a certain way of being and projecting oneself, as opposed to when Solomon Northup is a free man in the city with his family, well-dressed. So hopefully you can see the contrast there that the filmmakers are trying to offer between city and rural. And here it is again. Solomon as an enslaved person on a plantation versus as a free man in the city, it's a pretty obvious contrast. And these are actually more contemporary images of Mr. Northup in his plantation suit labeled there, and then meeting back with his wife Anne once he's released from bondage, once he self-emancipates. And then these are Mercy Street. And I really like them for a lot of reasons. If you want to have a conversation about Mercy Street, I'm happy to do that in a different forum. But essentially, this man is free and he is actually very educated. This man is enslaved. This young man is enslaved. This young woman is enslaved and a laundress. This older woman is enslaved, but a house servant, that would be her job. She would be a lady's maid. She is better dressed than the laundress, who doesn't really see people, who isn't really in contact with the enslaving family or their guests. Interestingly enough, this character does have a bit more agency. She's portrayed with more agency. She offers opinions when asked. They are not always accommodating of the enslaver that holds her in bondage. She occasionally is sassy, which I really appreciated, because it's not just that her opinions were tolerated, they were received and accepted and considered. So there is a really interesting portrayal of agency here. This woman has a lot of tragedy befall her, and she seems to have a lot less choice in the circumstances that are presented to her, and still within that, she makes choices, and they're really impactful. She also talks to this young man who's enslaved, and she reminds him that he has some agency and he has some choice, and that in the city of Richmond, when an enslaved person comes into the city in this day and age, this is during the Civil War, Richmond is a free city. And so that young man is free. If he walks through that gate, his freedom is his. All he has to do is take it. And you can see his choice here in the bottom left. This is an incredible series. It only lasted, I think, 2 or maybe 3 seasons. It was unbelievable. I'm so upset that it was canceled. Y'all should go watch it. This is just a portrayal of an enslaved wedding at night. So this is something that they got right and accurate, very nice. And this is a very poignant moment, a really impactful and dramatic moment in the series that I won't sort of spoil for you, but again, this is the free man who was helping out the doctors in the Mercy Street Hospital, and he's been brought out to the plantation and help has been requested of him. Educated man being requested to help those who are enslaved on the plantation. Again, I'm sorry, content warning for this. This one is a Canadian PBS show, a Canadian TV show that I haven't watched yet, and I want to. This is the next one I'm going to buy. It is named after the book that Sir Guy Carleton wrote. He was a British agent who was marking down escaped, self-emancipated people who fled to the British lines during the American Revolution and were subsequently evacuated as Black loyalists to Halifax, Nova Scotia. So I can't give a recommendation on this yet. I just wanted to put it up there for y'all to see because it's my next watch. And then, of course, we all know these. These are sort of the standard for what was available until recently. Roots was really the first look for Americans at what the condition of enslavement that kidnapped Africans experienced in this country. It's very much a rural setting, and it's very much diluted, because I think that it was understood that the audience that might be watching it was still going to be uncomfortable with some of the more explicit truths that it would have had to offer. So I know that there's a new version of it. I gotta be honest, I haven't seen the new version of it, or if it is more explicit in its truth telling. Beloved and Django, both a little bit more, how would I say that, sort of stylized views, right? They're both fictional stories that are based in history. And so because of that, there is a little more creative freedom taken. We don't need Hollywood to tell us because the books are out there and they're very accessible. They're not all this, which actually this is a good one and you should read it anyway, even if you're not into like scholastic and academic books, but they're not all, you know, this thick. There are some really fantastic, accessible public history books that are being published. You don't have to see it on the screen, but if you do see it on the screen, check out Mercy Street. All right, so here's my recommended reading slide, and I'll make sure that Caitlin, I can send you all this information so that you can email it to folks as well with your follow-up email. Folks, take a screenshot of this, and with that, I will shut the heck up. Thanks, Caitlin.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Carin. We have a long list of questions. This has been such a powerful presentation and very thought-provoking. So first, let's just jump into our questions. First was, do you know about how many enslaved people there were in an average urban household? Did middle-class doctors or shopkeepers or what we would consider the average person enslave people in an urban setting?
I mean, the average enslaved holding for somebody who's middle class is probably not above 10. The vast majority of people who, it was a very minority population who held the most people in enslavement. So the planters who are out on the plantations have their city houses as well. So Nathaniel Russell and William Aiken Jr. being two of those sort of really upper class folks. They each had, Russell House had between 12 and 18 enslaved people in that small space. The Aikens something like 18 to 20 in their urban plantation. But even on small farms, small plantations, we're talking, you know, just a handful of enslaved individuals, if not even just one or two. So people who defended the cause of slavery, it's true, most of them didn't own anyone, or if they did, it was only one or two people, but it was the idea that this economy and this society was so wrapped up in and so dependent on the system that it made sense to defend the system even if one didn't actively participate in it, because you did, even if you didn't own somebody, you still, you know, used the resources that were provided to you by enslaving people. So I think the question of how many on average is really varied from place to place. Not that many.
Right, okay. One question I found interesting, are there any databases of descendants of enslaved people by region? This commenter was from Baltimore, for example.
That is a great question for your local historical societies. I would check with folks in Annapolis. I know that there's a new museum coming here to Charleston called the IAM, the International African American Museum, and they have an entire family heritage center that they're building, which is going to focus specifically on the genealogy of enslaved people, and that's supposed to be from all over. The other place that you might like, especially if you're in the Mid-Atlantic region, would be, of course, the National African American Museum, the Smithsonian, because they do have some record keeping and some databases, although I don't know how extensive they are or what regions they cover, but definitely the Smithsonian can help you out. They've got a genealogy department. But if you're interested in that locally, contact your local historic site. If you know that there's a site of enslavement near you, find out if they've got some information on the individuals who were enslaved there, and they can direct you out from there.
Yes, absolutely. One that I really wondered was about the topic that you were discussing about the discovery of the rat's nests in the built environment that you were showing us. Has the University of Pennsylvania determined the earliest possible date for those rat's nests?
I don't know, but I think pretty immediately. So the house was built and moved into in 1808. Rats have really interesting habits. Like if they have a space that sustains them, they don't ever move or carry anything further than 75 to 100 yards from where their nest is. Also, rats don't rob other rats' nests. So each nest is individual to one specific furry creature. And then when that creature dies, another furry creature could potentially put their nest on top of that one, but they wouldn't rob it. We know that the kitchen house was infested and that it provided so much food, warmth, shelter that they didn't even need to go into the main house.
But they were not modern day rats that have just moved into that space. They were potentially from this time period.
Oh yeah, the space is no longer infested. The property is ours now. we have plenty of control now. No, these are 100% historic from 19th century on.
Oh, you'll have to keep us up to date on the findings.
It's super gross.
It sounds so gross, but it's
so informative. We found a fragment of a Quaker reading primer. So somebody in that enslaved quarter was reading. Somebody was learning to read. Now, whether that was sanctioned by the Russell family or whether that was an opportunity that somebody saw and took on their own accord, we do not know. We cannot say. But a reading primer was found in a rat's nest in a slave quarter in Charleston.
That's incredible. Well, and just privies and outhouses, while they're disgusting, they were treasure troves.
Fantastic time capsules.
So that
love digging privies.
You'll have to send me an email when you find out.
Okay.
We have more questions. So let's see. Did Charleston have the highest ratio of enslaved Black Charlestonians to white Charlestonians in the country? So it was their ratio of enslaved Black people to free white people. What was that ratio? Do you know?
I don't know the ratio, but it was high. It was certainly the highest in the country, I'm sure. Again, the enslaved population declines in New York and Boston and Philadelphia pretty early in the 19th century. It's still happening there, but those cities are not dependent on enslaved labor. They're just in parts of the institution's process that allowed them to profit from it, but not be dependent on it. Whereas here in Charleston, in Savannah, and the reason that Charleston probably has a higher ratio is because Charleston's a bigger city. So Charleston and New York City trade. Can I stop sharing this screen now? Sorry.
Sure.
It's like my face looking at me. Charleston and New York City traded places for like the richest city in the colonies in the States over and over and over again in the 18th and 19th centuries. So Charleston being so dependent on enslaved labor. And the other thing that I should mention, I didn't say this earlier, but this is really important to note, 40% of all enslaved Africans that came to this country, 40% of the total came through the port of Charleston.
Wow.
The other 60% were dispersed among all the other port cities on the eastern seaboard. So the majority of people that came to one place came through here, and a lot of them stayed right here in the city or right in the immediate area. So that's one of the contributing factors, of course.
Okay.
Yeah. And I just really quick, I did see in the chat, I must have misspoken. When I was talking about it being illegal to murder one's own enslaved person, that was certainly on the state level. So that was the law here in South Carolina, that one could kill one's own enslaved person and not be prosecuted for it. But if one were to kill someone else's enslaved person, they could be prosecuted for it. That was indeed the state law
Sure.
here, not the overarching law. Yeah.
That did remind me of a scholarly work that I came across a couple years ago called Homicide Justified. And it was all about the legality of killing of enslaved people in the United States and Atlantic world. I think that author's name is Andrew Feed.
Okay.
F-E-D-E.
I'll have to check that out.
If anyone wants any more information on that, that's an excellent resource. Because there are a lot of laws, and especially the time period needs to also be taken into account. This is a heavily nuanced topic there.
Sure. I mean, just like everything revolving around the institution, again, that whole idea of it's not the same across time or place, and any time, anywhere, it's true. And the laws continue to change, and people continue to try to keep up or violate as they see fit.
Absolutely.
So it's really a complex subject to get our brains and our arms around.
Absolutely. Let's see. In your research, did you find that there was a gender disparity of any kind in urban enslavement? Were there perhaps more females in the urban setting than a rural setting?
Yes. Someone discusses that. I'm looking down in this direction because this is where my stack of books are. It might be in this one. It might be in Bernard Powers' book. He talks about enslaved demographics in terms of gender. But yes, I seem to recall reading in one of these, and there are a lot of them that talk about the disparity. If I had to guess, I'd say it's probably in Black Charlestonians, but I do remember coming across that. I don't have numbers for you. Again, terrible statistician, I'm sorry. But there were more females in enslavement in the city at one time than males.
Well, and when I email out the link of the YouTube recording of our talk today, I can include the sources that you recommend.
Yes.
So people have all sorts of avenues of things to research.
Yeah.
We just have a couple more questions, and then we'll let everybody go. Let's see. Oh, it was about the buildings that you were showing us. What was the point of having guests walk through that main working area? Was this perhaps to display the status and wealth, or was it typical of the architecture and landscape design in Charleston?
It wasn't. So that was the Aiken Rhett House, and it just happened to be that sort of U-shaped landscape because it takes up a major portion of a city block. The Nathaniel Russell House is also a corner lot on an alley instead of on a street. But the Russell House had the formal gardens to the side of the house, sort of in front, so you could either enter into the front door or enter into the formal gardens, and then the workyard was behind. So it could just be a function of landscape architecture and where things were placed and where things were efficiently placed. The kitchen house had to necessarily be near the home in order to deliver food promptly and, you know, on time and hot. So it kind of, for that one property, facilitated, because the house fronted on the whole rest of the yard. The Nathaniel Russell House is set back from the street, whereas the Aiken Rhett House is right on the street. So I think it's more a function of efficiency in landscape architecture than anything, but there is some suggestion that there's always the opportunity for a display of wealth. There's always the opportunity. It was done at plantations like, you know, the one that I used to work at, where, you know, let's go tour the rice fields and you can see all of the people that I own working on this Carolina gold that's so beautiful and makes me all my money. We know that that was a thing that happened. So certainly that comes into play, but whether that was the reason, I imagine probably not, but we can't say, yeah.
Okay. All right. Just two more. What was, or do you know what the financial loss may have been in the South when slavery ended? This commenter said that they were told on a visit to Charleston that it was potentially a $3 to $4 billion loss, and why many enslavers moved to Texas to continue their investment.
Man, I do not know by the numbers, but I do know, I mean, it was catastrophic. If we were already by the 1860s counting profits and losses in the billions, it wouldn't surprise me at all if that was the correct number. A lot of slaveholders absolutely abandoned, specifically Charleston and the Savannah area, for Texas, which again, you know, made no never mind in the end, because the end of the Civil War eventually affected all areas, but it was catastrophic. I mean, it was absolutely catastrophic to a way of life.
It's also a very hard question, simply because the system of putting a value on a human soul can not really be done.
Right.
This is, so I kind of question if we can even put a number on this.
Right.
Exactly.
Right. And I mean, the rest of the property, land, houses, stuff, sure, there's surely a valuation to be put there, assuming that the records that were kept were accurate and assuming that we have all of them. A lot of records in the South were burned when cities fell. The city of Richmond comes to mind.
Right.
Because you know, city records, financial records are being destroyed. So who knows what the real number is? And I'm sorry to say that I don't know an exact number here in Charleston, but I do know that it was absolutely catastrophic for this way of life. Yeah.
All right, last one is from me. You showed us some really incredible images of buildings in Charleston, specifically some with Historic Charleston Foundation. So what are your all's tour options? What are ways that visitors can come and see these spaces and have discussions about this topic in the environment that we're talking about?
Yes, you can come see us. We're open 7 days a week. The Nathaniel Russell House and the Aiken Red House. And I would love it if in your follow-up email you put links to our spaces where people can go. If you are able to visit the Charleston area, I strongly recommend visiting, of course, our house museums. You can get a combined ticket and see both places. We have an audio tour, an app that works for both houses, but we also have guided tours of the Nathaniel Russell House, I think every hour. So if you would like to talk with a docent about it, you do have that opportunity. If you want to talk with me about it, or one of my museum department colleagues, we can certainly arrange something like that. We do connoisseur tours and things like that if you want to really get deeper into the subject. I also do our brand new digital initiative. If you can't visit us, Harborside History. Thank you for letting me plug my new YouTube channel. And there was a link in my thank you screen about that. But that's Historic Charleston Foundation's YouTube channel is now hosting Harborside History. So if you cannot join us, you can still see these spaces and talk about these topics, because that's what we'll be doing through this digital program once a month. And
absolutely.
Yeah, so thank you.
So send me all the links that we need, and I will share them to our registrant list.
I definitely will.
That was the last of our questions. We thank you so much for being with us today, lending us your time and talents.
Of course.
To our registrants, if you have any other follow-up questions, you can feel free to email them to me, and I will send them along to Carin. We thank you all so much and hope you enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.
Have a great Wednesday, everybody. Thank you so much. Thanks for listening.